I recognize the gentleman from California for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Mr. Jipping, I introduced a call for a constitutional convention for a balanced budget when I was in the state assembly close to 40 years ago now. And the arguments against it came from the right. But they were exactly the same arguments we're hearing from Mr. Spalding and the Democrats that, well, you have no idea, a runaway convention, there's no way to limit it, it could go out of control. But isn't it true that a constitutional convention has no more power to change a punctuation mark on the Constitution than the U.S. Congress has held every single day that it has sat for nearly 250 years? In either case, the product, whether it comes from the Congress or a convention, has to be ratified by 3/4 of the states.
That's a critical point that hasn't been heard here today much, and that is the ultimate stopgap of both methods of proposing amendments is that 3/4 of the states have to ratify it.
That's the ultimate check. But Dr. Primo, I share your desire for a balanced budget amendment, but the process you outlined seems to me to be attempting to micromanage our affairs into times that we can't foresee. I mean, defining classes of spending and revenue, specifying what constitutes an emergency, multi-year accounting periods, fluctuations in economic performance, a smoothing approach, whatever that means. The beauty of the American Constitution is in its simplicity and its humility. In crafting a balanced budget amendment, it seems to me we need to maintain these qualities. We shouldn't be attempting to tell future generations specifically how they should manage their revenues and expenditures. What is a balanced budget? Isn't it simply a budget that doesn't require us to borrow? If that's the case, why don't we just say so? That's the essence of the amendment that Thomas Jefferson advocated. Instead of trying to define fiscal years, outlays, expenditures, revenues, emergencies, triggers, sequestrations, and so on, I hope we could just consider 27 simple words. The United States government may not increase its debt except for a specific purpose by legislation adopted by 3/4 of the membership of both houses of Congress. That's sort of an amendment that would naturally require both a balanced budget and a prudent reserve to accommodate fluctuations in revenues and routine contingencies. It trusts that 3/4 of the Congress will be able to recognize a genuine emergency when they see it, and that 1/4 of Congress will be strong enough to resist borrowing for light or passing reasons. That is actually my House Resolution 9. What's your opinion of that approach?
Thank you for the question. I am sort of, my focus is that, in fact, or the way I would think about it is, the proposal I have where you sort of allow for a smoothing approach is actually, it's actually placing less of a restraint on Congress to follow the rules in the Constitution, if you will. In other words, it's saying to Congress that you need to have some flexibility, that you may not have perfect balance year in and year out, and it would be impractical to call everything an emergency, right? So if you required a 3/4 vote to exceed the...
Well, if you can't borrow, you're rather forced to do that, and that's the whole point of the amendment, is to force the Congress to live within its means, but not tell it how to do that. I would commend that to your consideration. Mr. Tumbelides, the founders considered term limits for members of Congress. They explicitly rejected them. I was only one of 2 sitting members of the California Assembly to endorse legislative term limits in 1990 in California. It's Prop 140. It set a 6-year limit on the Assembly at the time. I thought it was going to encourage more goal-oriented members, be much more skeptical of the bureaucracy, much more resistant to the legislative leaders. As karma would have it, I left the Assembly in 1992 when the term limits had no practical effect. And I returned in 1996 when they had complete effect, and the differences that I saw were absolutely jarring. They achieved the opposite of their intended effect. Instead of arriving in the legislature contemplating their political mortality, members simply arrived contemplating their next political move. They had no experience in state government, so they were far more dependent on the bureaucracy. And since their term was limited, they were far more dependent on the leadership since it was limited, for their next political move. Prior to term limits, members on the committees often had far more experience in the subject matter than the bureaucracies appearing before them. Term limits stripped the legislative branch of this advantage. It shifted enormous influence from the legislative branch to the bureaucracy. Before term limits, there was a sense of loyalty to the institution and the process. After term limits, there wasn't any. I would just urge you and my conservative colleagues who mistakenly believe that term limits is going to improve the legislative branch, please look to states like California that succumbed to that siren song and ask yourself if you really want to send the Congress in that direction. I yield back.
Gentlemen's time's
May I respond to that?
Go ahead. Yeah, we'll let you respond.
Yeah, so you mentioned the framers of the Constitution. They were actually quite divided about whether we needed term limits for Congress or not.
They rejected them.
Not all of them. Benjamin Franklin
No,
supported
but
them.
the majority of them rejected it for very good reasons. Among them, according to Madison,
That may be true, but
that someone approaching a term limit would become far more interested in their self-interest rather than in the nation's interest. That's just human nature.
when Thomas Jefferson...
Let me interrupt, because we're gonna have votes called again soon, and I don't want to leave anybody hanging. We'll get back to that.
Sure.
The chair now recognizes the gentlelady from Vermont for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. It seems to me that a lot of the momentum behind the efforts to hold an Article 5 convention is based in extreme frustration with our